I thought she didn't notice me, until her smirk said everything. It started as just another ordinary day, one of those gatherings that felt familiar yet slightly distant, because he wasn't used to feeling seen in this world. He had come with his friend to a small weekend get-together. The kind where laughter bubbled from corners, and conversations drifted lazily through the room. He thought he would spend most of the time blending into the background, a quiet observer of other people's lives. But then, he saw her. His friend's older sister was standing near the sunlit window, casually leaning on the frame, a glass of iced tea in one hand, the other tucked lightly into the pocket of her jeans. She was 41, graceful, effortlessly poised, and he found himself noticing every detail. The way her hair caught the afternoon light, how a few loose strands framed her face. The soft curve of her smile when she laughed at a joke he couldn't even hear. She radiated confidence, but it wasn't brash or showy. There was a warmth there, a quiet magnetism that pulled him in despite his attempts to stay unnoticed. He felt a strange mixture of curiosity and intimidation. He was 24, still learning to navigate the subtle currents of adult interactions, and here was someone who seemed to move through the world with a kind of calm certainty he envied. Yet he couldn't look away. Every small movement she made, how she tilted her head as she spoke, the gentle gesture of brushing a hand through her hair, the soft tap of her foot against the floor, felt amplified, as if his entire world had quietly narrowed to the space she occupied. He told himself she didn't notice him. Surely, she had seen hundreds of faces today, dozens of acquaintances and strangers alike. Why would she notice him, a younger man barely making an impression? And yet, when her eyes flicked briefly in his direction, he felt a jolt in his chest, a strange flutter he couldn't name. It lasted only a second before she looked away, focused on the conversation across the room, but it was enough. Enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had noticed him too. He found himself lingering near the edges of the room, stealing glances under the guise of checking his phone, or observing other conversations. Each time she moved, laughed, or shifted, it was as though the air around her carried a soft current that pulled him closer, even as his mind told him to stay distant. There was a tension in his chest he couldn't explain, a quiet longing mixed with admiration, a desire to understand this woman who seemed simultaneously untouchable and inviting. In that moment, he realized something profound. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. There was something in the way she existed in the world, her confidence, her warmth, her gentle playfulness, that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't before. And though he tried to rationalize it, to tell himself she wouldn't notice, a tiny, unshakable voice inside him whispered otherwise. He was seen, even if only for a heartbeat, and that realization would haunt him, and excite him, for days to come. He told himself it was coincidence. That's what he repeated over and over in his head, as he walked down the narrow aisle of the grocery store, only to find her standing just a few steps ahead, her hand resting on the cart as she examined a jar of sauce. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, highlighting the faint gold flecks in her hair, and for a moment, he froze. His pulse kicked up, a sudden rush of heat spreading across his chest. She hadn't noticed him yet, or so he assumed. He shuffled forward awkwardly, trying not to stare, trying to act as if it were completely normal to be so close to her. But then, as if reading his thoughts, she turned, her eyes meeting his, and there it was, a smirk. Small, knowing, teasing, and completely intentional. His stomach lurched. He stumbled over a few words, greeting her softly, trying to sound casual while every nerve in his body seemed alert, humming with awareness. She tilted her head slightly, the smirk lingering, and said something light, innocuous, almost like a joke. But her eyes held a sharpness, a glint of awareness that made him realize this was no ordinary glance. She had noticed him. After that, everything felt charged. Every accidental bump, every brief meeting in hallways or at cafes, carried a silent electricity. She seemed to appear just when he least expected it, at the corner table of a coffee shop, in the park when he went for a walk, or standing behind him at the bus stop. And each time, there was a moment, brief but undeniable, when their eyes met. Sometimes it was a glance, other times a smirk, or a small, knowing smile that lingered far too long for it to be casual. He found himself analyzing each encounter obsessively afterward. Had she leaned slightly closer on purpose? Was that touch on his arm intentional? Each small gesture became magnified in his mind. The brush of her fingers as she handed him a book, the subtle tilt of her head when she laughed, the way her eyes seemed to linger on him longer than they did on anyone else. It all felt deliberate. And yet, there was a quiet tension that kept him on edge. How far could he read into this? Was it really attraction, or just playful friendliness? He wasn't sure he was ready to risk asking. Risking the fragile connection of these fleeting, charged moments. He found himself caught in the middle of curiosity and caution, desire and hesitation, his mind spinning with possibilities, while his body betrayed him with every racing heartbeat. Through all of this, the world seemed sharper, more alive. The ordinary moments, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of traffic, the warmth of the sunlight, felt suddenly infused with meaning, all because she was there, aware of him. Each accidental encounter became a small revelation, a brush against the edges of something he couldn't yet name, but couldn't ignore. And deep down, he knew that this shared recognition, this spark, was only the beginning. After the accidental encounters, things began to settle into a rhythm, subtle yet electric. He noticed her more often, and not just in passing. There were moments where their paths crossed naturally, without pretense, where the world seemed to shrink to the small bubble they shared. It could be at his friend's apartment, while helping with some mundane chore, sitting together in a quiet corner at a cafe, or even standing side by side at a local market. The moments were ordinary, but for him, they were charged with an undercurrent he couldn't ignore. She had a way of moving that made shared space feel intimate, without ever forcing it. When she leaned slightly closer to point something out, he felt a warmth he couldn't name. When her hand brushed the edge of his as they reached for the same item, it lingered for just a fraction too long, enough to send an electric thrill up his arm. Each brush of her fingers, each small alignment of their bodies in the same space, felt meaningful, deliberate, or perhaps he was imagining it. He found himself quietly studying her gestures, the tilt of her head as she laughed, the small arch of her brow when she made a joke, the subtle curve of her lips that hinted at amusement. These details replayed in his mind long after she was gone. She seemed so confident, yet approachable, a delicate balance that both fascinated and intimidated him. And every time he caught her glance lingering on him, even for a fleeting second, it made his pulse quicken. It wasn't just physical awareness that drew him in, it was the comfort of proximity, the unspoken understanding that seemed to exist between them. When they sat side by side, her shoulder close to his, the world around them faded. He noticed the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the soft rustle of her hair when she shifted, the warmth radiating from her presence. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt clumsy compared to the language they were already speaking with glances and subtle touches. Even silence felt charged. A shared laugh over something small, a quiet nod in agreement, the brief contact of their knees under the table. It all carried an intimacy that went beyond words. He realized he was starting to crave these moments, not just the ones where she noticed him, but the ones where simply being near her was enough. And he sensed, with a mix of hope and fear, that she might feel it too. By the end of the day, he knew something had shifted. The dynamic had evolved from simple observation to a quiet connection, a delicate dance of proximity and awareness. She was aware of him, and he of her, in a way that transcended casual attention. It was as if they were the only two people in the room, yet somehow still part of the larger world. He walked away with a lingering warmth in his chest, a quiet thrill, and the unmistakable realization that the spark he had felt before was beginning to take shape into something deeper. Something that demanded attention, even if he wasn't ready to name it yet. It started as a small, harmless challenge, though he didn't recognize it as such at first. They were both in the kitchen, helping clean up after another casual gathering at his friend's apartment. He reached for a dish at the same time she did, and their hands brushed. Instantly, a jolt of electricity ran through him, and he quickly pulled back, embarrassed, as if retreating could somehow erase the thrill. She noticed, of course. She smirked, just slightly, one corner of her lips tugged upward in a way that made him acutely aware of the tension simmering between them. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, as though she had orchestrated the encounter just to watch his reaction. And perhaps, in some subtle, unspoken way, she had. "Careful there," she teased softly, her voice light and warm. "Wouldn't want to start a fight over a plate." He laughed nervously, trying to recover, but his heart was pounding. There was a playfulness in her tone that carried more weight than the words themselves. An awareness of him, a gentle testing of boundaries. He realized then that these little interactions weren't accidents. She was noticing him, responding to him, and subtly letting him know that she enjoyed this quiet dance. As the evening progressed, the playful tension continued. They found themselves paired in small tasks, organizing the dishwasher, folding napkins, moving items around, and each time, there was that subtle closeness, the near touch that lingered just long enough to be felt, but never crossed a line. When she leaned over to reach something on the counter, he caught the faint warmth radiating from her arm brushing against his. When their eyes met, she held his gaze for just a beat longer than necessary, and he felt his chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. The playful challenge wasn't just physical, it was mental. She tossed small, teasing comments his way, gently provoking him into quick, witty responses. Each time he stumbled or hesitated, her smirk widened, and he felt a strange, thrilling mix of embarrassment and longing. He wanted to win her favor, to meet her wit with his own, and yet, part of him wanted to freeze in place and simply be near her. He noticed, too, how these small moments made him more aware of her presence in general. The subtle sway of her posture, the casual way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the warmth in her smile when she laughed, it all became amplified. Even the mundane details, the scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her clothing as she moved, felt heightened, intimate, and slightly intoxicating. By the time the night ended, he realized this playful tension was something new. It was electric, teasing, and deliciously frustrating all at once. He was acutely aware that she was deliberately drawing him in, testing him, and perhaps daring him to notice just how much he had already fallen under her quiet spell. And he knew, deep down, that this first playful challenge was only the beginning of a subtle, simmering dance that would gradually pull them closer, both physically and emotionally, in ways he couldn't yet predict, but desperately wanted to experience. The playful tension had softened into something quieter, more intimate. He noticed it first on a late afternoon when they were sitting on a small bench in the park, waiting for their friends to finish a quick errand. The sun was low, painting the leaves with a golden hue, and the warmth of the day seemed to settle comfortably around them. For the first time, he realized that being near her wasn't just thrilling, it was comforting. She spoke quietly about small, everyday things at first, and then, almost imperceptibly, she began to open up about things that mattered more. Her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before, a softness that hinted at experiences and challenges she rarely shared with others. He listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her gaze occasionally dropped to the ground before meeting his again. When he spoke, he matched her openness. He confessed small vulnerabilities, details about his own life that he hadn't shared with anyone else. He felt awkward, exposed, but she listened, truly listened, and when she reached over, brushing a strand of hair behind his ear as she smiled softly, the gesture was casual, yet intimate enough to make his heart skip a beat. Physical closeness became natural in this new dynamic. They sat a little closer than necessary, shoulders brushing, knees almost touching. At one point, when she shivered slightly in the evening breeze, he instinctively offered his jacket. She hesitated for only a moment before accepting, draping it around her shoulders and letting him adjust it gently. It was a small, seemingly mundane gesture, but it spoke volumes. Comfort, trust, and a silent acknowledgement of the growing connection between them. He became attuned to every subtle cue, the tilt of her head when she wanted him to respond, the way her fingers brushed against his hand when she laughed at something he said, the fleeting warmth in her eyes when their gazes met. There was a quiet rhythm to these moments, a dialogue unspoken yet profoundly understood. Each glance, each touch, carried emotional weight, and he realized that this wasn't merely attraction. It was a deepening intimacy, a slow unveiling of who they were to each other. The vulnerability was mutual. She shared moments of doubt, insecurities she rarely revealed, and he offered reassurance, not as a savior, but as someone who truly cared. Their conversation ebbed and flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter, soft sighs, and pauses that didn't feel awkward, but instead filled with unspoken understanding. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the park bathed in a warm, soft twilight, he knew something significant had shifted. This was no longer a casual fascination or fleeting attraction. They had crossed an invisible threshold, entering a space where emotional intimacy and subtle physical affection coexisted, where their connection was tangible yet still fragile. He felt a thrill unlike any before, not just in desire, but in the quiet comfort of being understood and accepted by her. And in that realization, he sensed that the spark between them had deepened into something far more meaningful. Something that neither playful teasing nor accidental encounters could ever fully capture. The night air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of early winter leaves, as he walked beside her on the quiet street. The world around them was hushed, distant laughter and traffic fading into a soft background hum. Every step he took felt weighted, each breath heavy with anticipation, because tonight, he knew, something had shifted between them. The playful teasing, the shared smiles, the subtle touches, they had all led to this delicate, electric moment. They reached a small park, dimly lit by a few scattered lampposts. She stopped, turning slightly to face him. The cool light cast gentle shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the soft line of her jaw, and the way her eyes seemed to glow with quiet awareness. For a moment, neither spoke. There was only the sound of their breathing, mingling with the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. He felt his hands tighten slightly at his sides, the words he had rehearsed all evening teetering on the edge of his tongue. He wanted to tell her everything, the way his heart had raced every time she looked at him. The thrill he felt when their hands brushed, the quiet longing he had carried since their first accidental glance. But the words felt too fragile, too heavy, too important to rush. She shifted slightly closer, her shoulder brushing his. The contact was electric, yet entirely gentle. Her smirk returned, just barely, teasing and knowing, as if she could sense his internal struggle. "You've been awfully quiet tonight," she murmured, her voice low and warm. There was no judgment in it, only curiosity, and maybe, he dared to hope, a touch of shared anticipation. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. Her eyes held a patience and understanding that made his chest tighten. Finally, the words slipped out, clumsy yet sincere. "I think about you. A lot. More than I should, maybe, but I can't help it." He paused, searching her face for any sign of rejection, fear curling in his stomach. "I don't want to make things awkward, but I need you to know." For a heartbeat, she didn't respond. Then she smiled, slow and deliberate, her eyes sparkling with the kind of warmth that melted every ounce of doubt he had carried. "I've noticed you," she said softly, leaning just slightly closer so that her hand brushed against his arm. "Longer than you think." The words, simple yet profound, made his chest swell. Relief, excitement, and tenderness collided, leaving him dizzy with emotion. He wanted to reach for her, to close the space between them, but instead, they lingered in that quiet tension, letting the moment breathe. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining, and the warmth of that simple touch said more than words ever could. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, hearts racing in unison, the quiet night wrapping them in its gentle embrace. Every glance, every slight touch, every pause held meaning. In that suspended space, he realized that the bond they had been nurturing, the playful encounters, the shared moments, the vulnerability, had blossomed into something undeniable. Desire and trust intertwined, fragile yet strong, leaving them both aware that this was just the beginning of a connection neither wanted to let go. The first light of morning filtered through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold, and he realized he hadn't slept much. Not because of restlessness, but because his mind kept replaying last night. The quiet park, the confession, her smile, and the gentle brush of her fingers against his arm. Everything had shifted. Everything had changed. They sat together on the small balcony outside her apartment, a shared cup of coffee warming their hands, the city around them slowly stirring awake. The world felt quieter, somehow more intimate, as if the city itself had acknowledged the bond between them. He glanced at her, and she caught his gaze immediately, a soft, knowing smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't playful this time. It was full of trust, warmth, and something deeper, something permanent. "I still can't believe we're here," he admitted, his voice low, tinged with awe. He shifted slightly closer, the subtle brush of their shoulders sending warmth through him. Her hand found his naturally, fingers intertwining as if they had always belonged together. She laughed softly, leaning into him just enough to rest her head briefly on his shoulder. "I've felt it too," she murmured. "Long before last night, I think." The words were simple, yet the weight behind them was immense. It wasn't just desire or curiosity. It was understanding, connection, and acceptance of one another, flaws and all. For a while, they just sat there, letting the silence speak. It was a comfortable silence, filled with mutual awareness. Every glance, every touch, every tiny gesture carried the depth of what had grown between them. He brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and she tilted her face slightly, eyes softening, lips curving into that gentle smile that had haunted his thoughts for weeks. "I never thought," he began, pausing to find the words. "I never thought someone like you would notice someone like me." Her laughter was quiet, melodic, full of warmth. "I've noticed you from the beginning," she said, fingers brushing along his hand in a tender, deliberate caress. "You just needed to see it for yourself." It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no rushed confessions, just quiet, mutual acknowledgement, and the steady pulse of two people fully present with one another. They leaned closer, foreheads touching, sharing the warmth of breath and the small, steady rhythm of their hearts. He felt her hand squeeze his gently, and he returned the gesture instinctively, feeling an unspoken promise pass between them that they were together now, fully aware of each other, willing to face the world side by side. The morning stretched on, filled with laughter, soft conversation, and lingering touches. A hand on the back, fingers brushing accidentally yet deliberately, shoulders close enough that warmth passed freely. Every small gesture reinforced what they both knew: this connection, nurtured over weeks of observation, playful teasing, and shared vulnerability, had blossomed into something lasting, profound and safe. And as they finally rose to move through the day, hands still entwined, he caught her smirk, the same knowing, teasing curve of her lips from their first encounters, now full of warmth, trust, and the quiet joy of two people who had found each other against the odds. It was a smirk that said, without words, "We're here, together, and this is just the beginning." Did you feel the tension and the quiet connection between them? If you love this slow, burn-age gap romance, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story where emotions and desire build even deeper. And comment below, who was your favorite moment between them? I'd love to hear what pulled at your heart.